In the last video, we discovered something shocking. The tree of knowledge was not evil. The fruit wasn't poison. And curiosity wasn't the real sin. The real issue was rebellion. But that raises a bigger question. If the tree wasn't the problem, what exactly did the fall do to humanity? And why did the world never recover from Eden? That's what we are unpacking today. The expulsion of humanity from the Garden of Eden profoundly impacted human spirituality. The bond between humans and God, the source of their hope, peace, and joy, was broken, leaving them to face a grim future outside of God's presence. However, God was devising a solution in the heavenly council. A major consequence was the introduction of guilt into human consciences. Adam and Eve felt troubled upon realizing their nakedness, which symbolized the sinful nature they acquired after yielding to Satan's temptation. Consider what the Lord declares in Romans 3:10-12 regarding humanity and its descendants. There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good. No, not one. This indicates that all people are guilty before God and merit the death penalty. When the first man yielded to Satan's temptations, death was introduced to humanity, as explained in Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as through one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men, because all sinned. Recall that death did not exist in the Garden of Eden, because there was no sin, as death is the consequence of sin. However, a rebellion against God's authority occurred, and death swiftly ensued. Did God place the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden to entice Adam and Eve with evil? Certainly not. According to James 1:13-15, temptation originates from within a person rather than from external sources. Eve succumbed to temptation after Satan spoke to her. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. It was not the act of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that led to man's demise, but rather his blatant defiance of God's directive. Man fell into the grasp of death. The emphasis in Adam and Eve's eating from the tree is that they gained experiential knowledge of evil, not divine holiness or wisdom. God embodies light, devoid of any darkness. Thus, when God warned man, "You shall surely die," he implied that death would ensue on the day man defied him. Ezekiel 33, verse 12 supports this by stating, "The righteousness of the righteous shall not deliver him in the day of his transgression." Adam and Eve were fashioned in the image and likeness of God, meaning they were as blameless as innocent children and were given authority over the Garden of Eden. Naturally, they were unaware of their creation in God's image. Otherwise, Satan would not have tempted them with the promise of becoming like God. Lucifer was present when God proclaimed the creation of man in his own image and likeness. He understood God's nature, image, and likeness. Consequently, when he realized, as the morning star, that he would not be part of this creation. He set out to disrupt the image and likeness of God in humanity. It is reasonable to infer that Satan waited until the man was placed in Eden, then discreetly guide him toward being like God. Satan recognized that the man would acquire knowledge akin to that of the divine concerning both good and evil. However, the fundamental issue lay in the corruption of the man's will, which would become predisposed toward evil rather than good. This is precisely the state Satan desires for humankind. Consequently, the divine image in man would be warped to mirror Satan's own nature through the man's participation in Satan's defiance of God. Satan's initial conversation with Eve ignited a desire within her to attain godlike qualities, leading her to fall victim to his cunning deceptions. Despite God's explicit prohibition against consuming fruit from the tree, their aspiration to be like God overshadowed this directive. This ultimately led to their defiance and the introduction of death. Frequently, we may unconsciously harbor a similar aspiration to be like God. This is evident when we disregard the inner guidance of our conscience towards good, opting instead for evil. Actions such as conflict, pride, impurity, envy, self-serving ambitions, animosity, sorcery, drunkenness, heresies, and murder all signify rebellion against God's sovereignty. In essence, these transgressions embody Satan's image and likeness. While they clearly reflect his image, his likeness is one of defeat, not dominion. The allure of knowing right from wrong was so strong for Eve that, upon seeing that the tree's fruit looked good for food, appealing to the eyes, and promised wisdom, the woman decided to pick and eat some. She then shared it with her husband, and he ate as well. Because the woman paid undue attention to Satan's persuasive posturing, her perception of the tree became unholy. She was unaware that her general demeanor was being altered by sinful perception as she longingly gazed at the tree. Good for food was actually craving for sensual gratification. Pleasant to the eyes was actually greedy longings of the mind, and desirable to make one wise was pride of life or assurance in one's own resources. This was the beginning of man's perception of things from Satan's point of view. Man caught Satan's perverted desire to be like God. This perversion is defined by defiance of God's authority. In 1 Samuel 15, for example, God was determined to punish Amalek for ambushing Israel when he returned from Egypt. So he sent King Saul to go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and should not spare anything, but in his own wisdom chose to spare Agag, king of the Amalekites, and the best of the sheep, oxen, lambs, fatlings, and all that he deemed good. He did this in defiance of God's command. He actually usurped God's authority. The fallen man prefers his own way over God's way. But God, in his mercy, admonishes him in Proverbs 14:12, stating, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." The fall of humanity has had a profound effect on human spirituality, manifesting in an unwavering pursuit of self-perceived wisdom. However, the fall of man was not the end of God's story. Man experienced a state of loss through Eden. However, the prospect of redemption had been predetermined. Whereas Adam exercised disobedience, Christ exemplified obedience. In contrast to man's attempt to attain divinity through rebellion, Jesus demonstrated humility through submission. Sin didn't just make man guilty, it corrupted the image of God within us. And no amount of knowledge, effort, or moral striving could fix that. That's why God didn't send information. He sent a person, Jesus. Christ entered the world as the last Adam, not to seize authority, but to restore it, not to define good and evil apart from God, but to perfectly reveal the heart of the Father. At the tree in Eden, man said, "My will, not yours." At the cross, Jesus said, "Not my will, but yours be done." And in that obedience, sin lost its power, death lost its claim, and the image of God in man began to be restored. This is why the gospel is not about becoming like God through pride. It's about being made new through submission to Christ. If the fall came through rebellion, then restoration comes through surrender. And in Christ, that restoration is not a theory. It's a promise. So the question is no longer, what did we lose in Eden? The real question is, will we receive what was restored at the cross? Because the fall brought death, but Jesus Christ brings life.